Today we're going to do a comparison of several iOS compressor plugins. First thing I want to show you is how this is set up. So I have this tone, which is a logarithmic sine sweep from 20 Hertz going all the way up to 20 kilohertz. And I've put that same tone in the file player on each track. In each track, I've set the input gain at the same level, boosting it up a little bit so that the compressor has something to push down. And then I've got compressor settings that I tried to set the same across the board. There are places where certain compressors didn't have a setting or the setting was different, but I've got input gain at 0 because I wanted to boost the gain outside because some compressors don't have input gain. I've got the attack at 5 milliseconds, the release at 100 milliseconds, the output gain is flat. I've got the thresholds at negative 20 dB. I've set the ratio at 4:1, and if there's a wet mix, I've got it at 100%. So I have that same setup across all these compressors. I'll show you what I've got. This is the blue Mangoo compressor, and full disclosure, this is our own compressor. This is the Rough Rider from Audio Damage. This is the 4 Pockets compressor. This is the Woodpressor. This is the Woodpressor. This is Magic Death Eye. And this is NYCompressor. Now I've got a couple compressors that I couldn't test inside of AUM. At least I didn't see any way to do them in this same setup, so I did them elsewhere. In Auria, I have the channel strip compressor here on the Auria channel strip, and I have Fab Filter Pro-C too. Let's show the interface. So this is Fab Filter Pro-C 2. I have the standard GarageBand compressor. In Cubasis, I got 2 more compressors. So we have the channel strip compressor in Cubasis and the Cubasis compressor plugin. Okay, so this input that we're looking at now is the sine sweep that we use for testing. This is a logarithmic sweep going from 20 Hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. I'm going to play it. Let's look at this sine sweep in the time domain. So the key thing we noticed is that this is absolutely flat, flat spectrum all the way up till right up near to the end, and then it tapers off. So that is our test signal. The next compressor I want to look at is our own blue Mangoo compressor. Now, I'm going to flip back and forth between this compressor output and the test signal input. I want you to notice how similar these are. There's almost no difference at all. In fact, the only difference we see is if we look at the waveform view, when we zoom in on the beginning section, we can see that the compressor took about 5 milliseconds before the attack fully engaged, and so it allowed the signal to exceed the threshold volume before it pushed it down. Now, the way they've advertised this on their iOS page, it doesn't claim to be clean the way the blue Mangoo compressor does. In fact, one of the things that people love about their favorite compressors is they have their own characteristic tone, and they've advertised the Rough Rider as something that has, let's say, a rougher tone, has some character to it, and we can see that. Here's the input signal, here's the Rough Rider, here's the blue Mangoo, here's the Rough Rider. You can see there's a lot of additional harmonics being added by this compressor, and if you want that tone, this is a perfectly reasonable output for a compressor. There's only one thing that we see here that I wouldn't even go as far as saying it's a problem, but it's something that we need to point out for the context when we look at some other compressors that have similar features. On the right-hand side here, you see these places where the harmonics have gone past the Nyquist frequency, and then they spike down towards 0 hertz. And when we look at this color against this color scale over here, we see that the volume level of these harmonics that are aliasing into this range are at about 90 to 95 dB below 0. And that's happening at a time when the input, looking at the color here and comparing it in here, is at about 20-25 dB. So this is getting, on these high frequencies, getting a 60 or 70 dB of signal to noise ratio. And that's pretty good, especially given that this is a compressor that they're advertising as something that's a little bit of a rougher sound. I want to look at this in the time domain because you'll see something that we didn't see before. Here's the input signal in the time domain, flat across the entire spectrum. The Rough Rider starts to taper off. If we look at the time and frequency together, you can see when the input signal hits about 2.5, 3 kilohertz, about 3 kilohertz, the output starts to taper off. So this means that anything that you run through this compressor will have its high frequencies tapered down like this. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is the 4 pockets compressor. Let's look at it in the spectral view first. We can see this has a lot of light harmonics, but compared to the Rough Rider has these very strong first few harmonics and then tapers off quickly. This one has a lot more harmonics, but they're a lot lighter. So that's a different distortion characteristic. An impressive thing about this compressor is that we don't see any aliasing distortion up here. Now the aliasing distortion that we see here is probably not audible, but aliasing distortion is something that doesn't happen in analog compressors. This type of harmonic distortion that we see on the left side is a very analog characteristic, whereas this is something that only happens in the digital domain, and it's usually considered undesirable to have this aliasing distortion because it sounds like noise. It doesn't sound like related to the signal. The 4 pockets compressor, we see a little bit of aliasing going on in this frequency range. I'm not sure why. This is unusual. As you'll see with the other compressors, most of them will have no aliasing and then there'll be aliasing up at the top. Somehow this one is having a very, very light amount of aliasing. This looks like in the range of negative 105, negative 100 dB. So let's look at the waveform view on this 4 pockets compressor. It looks like I clipped the input a little bit when I recorded this. Next up, this is the Compressor from Clevgra. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. I'm going to zoom out again to get a smoother view. Very nice analog type of harmonic distortion in the low frequency range. It's gentler than, let's say, if we look back at the Rough Rider, you can see this first harmonic is very strong. The Compressor is a little bit gentler on the harmonic distortion. And a very, very slight aliasing noise in this range and in this range. Again, this is down near negative 100 dB at a time when the input signal is at about 25-30 dB. Let's look at this in the time domain. Now, this is interesting. On the low frequencies, we see that it is compressing less. And then when we get to, let's look at frequency and time together. When we get to not very high up, maybe 1-200 hertz, it flattens out and we have this flat region which extends all the way up to about 1 kilohertz, 1 point some kilohertz. And then there's another transition to, again, a lower compression threshold for the high frequencies. Now, I set this with the fastest compression time, and so it could be that the attack time is just so slow that these low frequencies didn't get compressed until here because this is the start of the signal. Or what I think perhaps more likely is that this is doing 3 different bands of compression. So I think it may have a low compression band with a slower time, and then a mid band here extending up to about 1 kilohertz with a different threshold and a different time, and then a high band as a third band. So that's just a guess. I'm not sure how they designed this, but it looks like probably a 3-band compressor with either 3 different thresholds or 3 different time constants, attack time constants. So that is the Compressor. Next one up, this is the Woodpressor. And what we see is a lot of strong harmonic distortion, starting from the very lowest frequencies, extending right up into the aliasing region, so that when we reach about 800 hertz, 900 hertz in the input signal, we start getting a lot of this high frequency aliasing distortion. Now, once again, this distortion we see that runs parallel with the signal. I'm going to try to smooth this out. These are called harmonic distortions, and these are characteristic of analog compressors and digital compressors, and they're a matter of taste. Sometimes you want them, sometimes you don't. But this digital aliasing distortion that we're seeing on the right side is generally something you want to avoid. Let's have a listen to this one. Okay, let's go on. Let's have a look at the time domain. Perfectly flat. There's a little spike at the beginning, same like most of the other compressors we saw, and then perfectly flat across the spectrum. The next one is, looking at my list, this is Magic Death Eye, which is an analog compressor model. This is a very analog compression characteristic with very strong harmonic distortion in these lower frequencies. This is going to have a very distinctive sound. It could be a very cool vibe for certain instruments. Let's have a listen. Early on at these low frequencies, you almost hear like as if you're hearing 2 sine sweeps, because the first harmonic here is so strong. And again, that's a matter of taste. Obviously, they've designed this compressor with the goal of doing that. But what we're seeing on the right side here is digital aliasing distortion. And if we look at where the gain peaks out, when it spikes down to about near 0 hertz, we're looking at a gain around negative 30 dB at a time when the input signal is at like negative 15. A lot of this distortion noise coming into at the high frequencies. But you've got a great analog tone at the low frequencies. This would be good for bass, guitars. Electric guitars tend to taper off at about 4 kilohertz, 3 to 4 kilohertz, and have almost nothing above that. Not so much because of the guitar, but because of the speakers in the amplifier. So this would be a good compressor for putting that kind of tone onto those instruments that are somewhat band limited. Let's have a look in the time domain. Now this is unusual. We haven't seen a compressor that has this much distortion of the input gain. So the input gain was flat, and when we come out on this side, it's significantly changing the input gain. This is a matter of taste, and this is a very compressor that has a very distinctive tone. But if you were to put this on a full mix, you should be aware that if you had EQ'd the mix, you would now have to re-EQ after putting the compressor on, because this is going to give you something totally different from what you started with. Compressor number 8. This is from the same developer as the Magic Death Eye. This is the NYCompressor. Very different characteristics. Let's look at this is Magic Death Eye. This is NYCompressor. These are going to sound totally unique to each other. Let's have a listen to the sine sweep. This one has harmonic distortion going up much higher in the spectrum. If you were to use Magic Death Eye, you can see, like, if you're playing low frequencies in the range of about 100 hertz, you'd have additional harmonics going up to about 1 kilohertz, but then it's totally clean above it, which is a very, that's going to be a very vibey sound. This kind of distortion goes up much higher. We're going up almost at like 100 hertz input signal. We're going all the way up to almost 8 or 9 kilohertz with these harmonic distortions. And again, this is a matter of taste, whether you want this kind of harmonic distortion or not. But on the right side, again, we're seeing some digital aliasing. So although this compressor is modeling an analog hardware circuit, this type of noise that we're getting on the right side would not have been present in the original analog hardware. Let's have a look at the time domain characteristics of this. Very flat, perfectly flat across the frequency range. I want to have a look at the attack section just for fun. This is one where, if I'm not mistaken, the attack time setting was a little unusual, so perhaps I had difficulty finding 5 milliseconds. It looks like it attacked much faster than 5 milliseconds because I don't see a spike at the beginning. This is, next up, the Cubasis channel strip compressor. So let's look at the time domain first, because that's jumping out at me. It looks like I set the makeup gain a little bit too high, so it clipped, but that's not the compressor's fault. It allowed it to peak up after about 5 milliseconds, squashed it back down, and ran flat across the entire spectrum till the end. No big surprises there. And when we look at the distortion characteristics in the frequency domain, we see it's very clean. I see these very, very tiny distortion harmonics, almost imperceptible, and then as it goes up into the higher range, we see no distortion. Just noticing that there's some distortion in this frequency range when the input signal is below, let's say it looks like about 1 kilohertz, and then it's clean above that, suggests to me that they might be running this compressor as a multiband compressor behind the scenes, where there's something different going on in the low frequencies, but that's just a guess. That is the Cubasis channel strip compressor. I'm going to play it. Very clean, very flat spectrum, appropriate for a channel strip. Next up, this is the Cubasis compressor plugin. I'm going to zoom out and zoom back in to get a smoother view. Let's look at this compared to the channel strip compressor. So we see a slightly different distortion characteristic. I don't see any aliasing here. When you look at this one, you see these lines going upwards on the channel strip, and then there are these parallel lines going downwards from above. These lines here are digital aliasing distortion, but very low volume. It looks like negative 105 dB. This is not audible level of distortion, but it's indication of some digital aliasing. This one is clean, clean, clean. There's a tiny bit of harmonic distortion, which again is a matter of taste, and then clean right up to the top with no aliasing of any kind. Interesting to look at this in the time domain though. I tried to set this compressor with a 5 millisecond attack time, and I couldn't for the life of me get it to look like the other compressors do when they're set at 5 milliseconds. Let's zoom in here and look at the attack. So clearly it's allowed the attack to come up and then down, but I have the attack time set at 50 milliseconds to get this. When I set the compressor attack time on this one down to 5 milliseconds, what I got was a perfectly flat attack, as if it was at 0 milliseconds. And that, coupled together with the fact that we see absolutely no aliasing distortion, suggests to me that perhaps this compressor is doing some look ahead. I'm not sure about that, but if it's not doing look ahead, then when you set the compressing time to 5 milliseconds, it will need to spike up and and then respond. But this one, even at 50 milliseconds, the spike didn't peak up above the clipping threshold like most of the others did. Like for example, Cubasis' own channel strip did. Let's have a listen to this. All right, what's next? Number 11, the GarageBand Compressor. This is the standard internal compressor in GarageBand, not a plugin or anything like that. Very clean, just one harmonic of distortion with a little bit of aliasing at the higher frequencies. This is a good choice for a compressor to put on a full mix because it doesn't change the tone very much. You might hear a little bit from this harmonic distortion here, and you might like that sound, and probably wouldn't hear this. This looks like 70 dB signal to noise ratio in the higher frequencies. Let's look at what that does in the time domain. Very typical compressor attack. Lets it spike up and then pushes it down. Nothing surprising here. Flat spectrum across the entire frequency. Did we listen to this yet? Let's have a listen. Next up is the Auria channel strip compressor. Zooming out, zooming in again. Very nice, very clean. I see almost imperceptible, and I mean imperceptible to the eye, aliasing distortion here. You see these X's here, but they have eliminated this brilliantly to the point where it's down almost off the scale, and I don't see any distortion. I want to compare back to our own Blue Mangoo compressor at this moment. The Blue Mangoo one doesn't have any distortion at all. Whereas when we look at the Auria channel strip, we've got some harmonic distortion, and then they've almost eliminated the aliasing distortion. So as we said before, this harmonic distortion is perfectly acceptable. It's a matter of taste. The aliasing distortion generally isn't wanted. So the challenge in this design of compressors is how can you have this distortion and not have this distortion? In a digital compressor, that's one of the hardest challenges. And so our Blue Mangoo compressor is taking the route of let's just not have any distortion. And that required some special design of the envelope follower. And this one has done something different where they've allowed a little bit of distortion, a little bit of tone to come in, but then they've very effectively squashed the aliasing down in the higher frequencies. This is Fab Filter Pro-C running inside of Auria with the clean setting and 5 milliseconds of attack. Now this 5 millisecond attack does not look like what we got from other compressors with 5 milliseconds. This looks like 0.5 milliseconds to me. This is a very fast attack, squashing it down. Looks similar to the last one. A little bit more distortion actually, aliasing distortion than the channel strip compressor, but also having some more of that nice harmonic goodness going on in the low range. So that's a Fab Filter Pro-C with the 5 millisecond attack that looks to me to be shorter than 5 milliseconds. This is the same setting, the same compressor, but I've got this one set with a 50 millisecond attack, I believe, and you can see this looks more like what we saw from other compressors. It has a nice spike going up and then it squashes it down. There's a complaint that we see from people who are talking about comparing compressors often that there's no standard definition of what attack time means. So you would think that when we say 5 milliseconds attack, well, it should be 5 milliseconds and then the compressor should be fully engaged. But since the compressors engage gradually, it's difficult to talk about when they're fully engaged because most of them engage in such a way that they never 100% lock in on a volume level. So some people talk about 5 milliseconds being when the compressor has done 10% of its excursion. Some people say 50%, some people are saying 90%. There's not a lot of agreement about how we actually measure attack time. The last one I want to show you, this is Fab Filter Pro-C inside of Auria, and this is with the classic setting. So let's look at the classic setting compared to the clean setting. This is clean, classic, clean, classic. On the high end, we don't see a big difference. The classic actually has less aliasing distortion at the top, and then some differences in the way it creates harmonic distortion at the bottom end. But overall, these two compressor profiles look very similar from the Fab Filter Pro-C. Let's listen to the clean setting. And we'll listen to the classic setting. In closing, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that is what type of context we would want to use each type of compressor. So the first thing I want to talk about is frequency response. When we look across this selection of compressors, we can see that a good number of them have a very flat response across the spectrum. And this is a characteristic that is appropriate, or I would say even necessary, if you're doing mastering, or if you've already got a mix and you're putting a compressor on the whole mix, or if you've got a bus and it's all EQ'd and you're trying to put a compressor down on the bus. You wouldn't want that compressor to come in and then distort your EQ. Like if you were using this one, it would clearly distort your EQ. Again, this is a matter of taste. There's nothing wrong with the way that this thing is doing EQ, but you would have to put the compressor on first before you do the EQ. You would, in general, I would recommend to choose a compressor that has a flat spectrum if I'm putting it on the whole bus. And if I'm trying to get a specific tone on an instrument, then I might go for one of these compressors that have these more distorted spectrums. The next thing is that if you have a compressor that has a lot of noise on it, you want to know what frequency range the noise is in. This Magic Death Eye is a great example. They get the low frequencies and this very vibey distortion characteristic. And then there's this aliasing noise at the high frequencies. So this is something that you would use on instruments where you're not so concerned about what's happening at the high frequencies. Whereas if you want, this is the Cubasis one, right? Cubasis channel strip. All the ones that we found inside of the DAWs, Auria, Cubasis, and GarageBand, all of them have these very clean compressors with very flat frequency response. And the idea here is you can use these on anything. They're not going to change your tone much. They're not going to distort your EQ, and that's why the DAW apps have these type of compressors. If I'm mixing a full mix and I just want the EQ to stay where it is, I would use our own Blue Mangoo compressor because this is not doing any distortion anywhere. That takes us to the end of our compressor shootout. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope that this will be useful in terms of choosing which compressor to buy and which compressor to put on which type of music.